I got to admit, I wanted to go to the other talk myself. Thanks to Jeffrey Martin and his efforts, everything's being recorded. And yes, tremendous benefit to the association.
How do you access that?
They will be up on our website. There will be a YouTube channel that will have all of the videos provided. Yes, yes, yes. So I'll be able to hear the other talk, and so will you. It was wonderful. All right, this morning I'm going to talk about marital therapy enhanced with EEG synchrony training. I will admit I'm not a marital therapist, marital counselor. I'm a trained psychologist, neuropsychologist, and neurofeedback therapist. But occasionally it presents itself to me an opportunity to do some marital counseling. And so what happened was when our instruments began to give us the ability to be able to do something called synchrony or coherence training, I couldn't hold back when the opportunity presented itself. So synchrony, what synchrony is, very simply, it's a simultaneous action, development, or occurrence. Just the word synchrony can apply to anything. It can certainly apply to the EEG. And when it does, we talk about coherence, synchrony, and phase. So we have coherence as a measure of similarity or correlation of EEG signals from two channels. If you'll notice here, you see there's a synchronous EEG in these two signals. They're perfectly in phase. Here, they're phase shifted, meaning they're the peak of this EEG, or this particular waveform, is not the same as this. So there's a phase shift. So these are synchronous, and these are phase shifted. And here you have a synchronous EEG, but when this peak goes up, this peak goes down, so they're 180 degrees out of phase. So you see, that's just the way when you're talking about waves in general, whether you're talking about ocean waves or EEG waves or wave theory, these are just common terms that are used. So we have synchronous, phase shifted, and synchronous and out of phase. So you probably know this. This is by way of background for most of you. And then we have something called phase shift, lock, and reset dynamics, which adds a layer of very interesting information to the EEG. The spontaneous EEG is made up of a mixture of synchronous processes that involve rapid phase shifts, approximately 30 milliseconds to 80 milliseconds, followed by a longer duration phase locking, 100 milliseconds to 800 milliseconds, of clusters of subclusters of neurons that are followed by another phase shift and subsequent phase locking of different clusters of neurons. And the integrated rapid sequencing of phase shifts followed by phase locking are two fundamental components of phase reset. Now, why is this important? Well, it's important simply because when you're looking at synchronous EEG signals and you see them in rapid succession, there's something more that's happening in the brain than just synchronous signals. They're what theoretically are allowing us to see the world not as the old 8 millimeter, 32 millimeter film, where you had a picture followed by another picture followed by another picture. Our brain actually sees reality that way. But because of the phase shift and phase locking mechanism, we see life as a continuous flowing film, so to speak. An autistic child has a problem with the phase locking and phase shifting. So very often their world is broken up into individual pictures that they see. So their world doesn't always necessarily flow together. It's one of the reasons why this is such a powerful technique when you're teaching autistic children, because the increase in the phase lock and phase shift, or phase shift and phase lock, the duration of those becomes longer, and it allows the autistic child to see the world in a much more continuous motion, flowing motion. So phase and timing are related when it comes to cognitive processing. And because it's difficult to read, I blew it up here. And this is the EEG bears the possibility to investigate oscillatory processes in the human brain. In the animal brain, it has been shown that the phase and cortical oscillations is related to the exact timing of neural activity. The potential role of the oscillatory phase and the phase synchronization for the explanation of cortical information processing has been largely underestimated in the human EEG until now. This was approximately 2009. This was written. It comes out of the German researchers. Here it is argued that the EEG phase synchronization reflects the exact timing of communication between distant and functionally related neural populations. The exchange of information between global and local neural networks and the sequential temporal activity of neural processing in response to incoming sensory stimuli. Three different kinds of phase synchronization are discussed in the paper that was referenced in the previous slide. Phase coupling between brain sites, phase synchronization across frequencies, and phase locking to external events. And in this review, work is presented demonstrating that the EEG phase synchronization provides valuable information about the neural correlates of various cognitive processes, and that it leads to a better understanding of how memory and attention processes are interrelated. So this idea of coherence and phase locking and phase shifting is integral to how the brain sees the world, how it interprets the world, and how movement of information occurs from one area of the brain to the other. The fact of the matter, all of the learning disabilities are the result of coherence abnormalities in the brain. Complex behavior such as reading comprehension, for example, if there's a breakdown anywhere in the movement of information from after the information hits the eyes, the optic nerve, fuel feeds it into the occipital region, and then it begins a process of decoding, where the brain is working with various parts of the brain, such as the receptive language, putting understanding on what the eyes are seeing. And ultimately, comprehension occurs in the frontal and prefrontal cortex. That movement of information, a breakdown anywhere along that chain of movement of energy, you might say, can cause dyslexia. A slowing of the reading, perhaps, if not total alexia. And so it's very important that we understand that within an individual, coherence is an important function of the brain, and its lack of coherence demonstrates lack of neural competency and the result of neuropathology that can show itself as any of the learning disorders or any of the other ways of looking at brain dysfunction. So we know that, and I don't want to get into too much detail here because we want to talk about some practical aspects of this, but coherence is consistency of phase differences between two signals over time for each frequency. So it's the basis within an individual for neural competency. Now when we begin to think what happens when our brain is in phase or coherent, or when it isn't, we know when it isn't, it causes learning problems. It causes problems in seeing the world as one flowing movie. And we know that when the brain moves into a hypercoherent situation, as it does when a person is doing transcendental meditation, that will often create feelings of well-being, harmony. People feel more intuitive. Again, everything in moderation, right? We don't want the brain to be hypercoherent. That's what actually happens in infancy. Our brain is hypercoherent. It hasn't begun to differentiate yet. And this is why the theory is that infants, when they hear a sound, may see color. Or when you go Google, Google, Google in front of them, it might invoke in them images or of something that they saw a few moments ago, because the lack of differentiation in their brain creates a distortion, you might say, of what they will later see as proper representations of the world. So hypercoherence can be thought of as immaturity in the brain. But as the brain develops and proper connections are made, when our brain then becomes coherent, as it does in this EEG, QEEG picture, people will report feelings of greater peace. So it would make sense, if that's the state of an adult brain when they're doing transcendental meditation, to perhaps begin to think about the practicality of using this for training two individuals. Yes?
I wanted to ask your opinion about if you're looking at extreme phase synchrony like that, or extreme coherence like that, that what the mechanism whereby it is more peaceful, presumably, is that with so much coherence, there's not a lot of parallel processing of different tasks going on at the same time, so that therefore the actual conscious experience is flow rather than attention going sequentially to different areas of thought or process.
Right, right. It's more of a feeling of being in the moment.
Yeah.
When the brain isn't processing information. There's an awareness, a dawning of awareness of experience on a level that's subjectively different than when we're actively processing information, moving through the world, emulating, dealing with problem solving and driving an automobile, these kinds of things. When we shut down the sensory input to the brain, and we just allow the brain to function within itself, so to speak, it becomes more aware of itself. And in that awareness lies some positive insight into bigger pictures. It allows us to see the bigger picture, or at least contemplate the bigger picture, perhaps. And there are many ways that people who are into the meditative process describe the subjective experience. Many people talk about a transcendence, a movement from the body, a deepening of awareness, of interconnectedness between human beings. And all of these occur when we're not otherwise occupied or preoccupied by life's challenges. So being a positive state within an individual that we know from multiple studies that have been done on TM meditators, over the years, it would make sense then to think that perhaps there could be something gained by trying to get two individuals to have a coherent signal. All right, so it's logical to do that. So there's a rationale for this. And I discussed this application with Les Femi many years ago, probably in the late 80s, maybe early 90s. And he discussed, I believe at one of the brain conferences in Key West, a successful application of two individuals using one channel of EEG. And for those of you who know Joe Hart, he gave a presentation at an AAPB meeting in Las Vegas, where he was working under Department of Defense grants, working with post-traumatic stress disorder, where he had a group of individuals who he was doing alpha training with, where they were doing alpha training individually, and then at one point they were hooked up to a common instrument, and the alpha tone would go on when they were in synchronous alpha. And he reported at this meeting that they began to have shared empathic experiences. That is, when one person was talking about their experiences in Korea or Vietnam, other people not only tuned into it in a way that was sympathetic, but they were actually feeling the emotions of the person who was speaking, which was at a much deeper level than had ever happened before in his experience of doing these type of groups.
Jim Hart or Joe Hart?
Jim Hart, I'm sorry, did I say, yeah, I'm sorry. Biocybernetics.
We are listening to you.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that. Biocybernaut. Okay. That's the name of his website and his company. Yes, Cybernaut. Okay. He went on, interestingly enough, to say that under this Department of Defense grant, they continued to do, with the same group of people, more training in using the alpha signal. And what was strange about this group was they then began to have shared telepathic experiences. This blew my mind. I had never heard of anything like this before. But it certainly opened me up to the fact that there must be something here. And
So they were all hooked up to a common lead?
They were all hooked up to a common lead feeding into one instrument that gave them a tone when they were in synchronous alpha.
But the advantage of the equipment he was using was that it's analog, so it's very fast, and also it's got 5 channels, so in theory you could connect it to 5 people.
Yes. Yeah, and that's what he did. And the shared telepathic experiences didn't only happen when they were in the same room. They happened when they were on opposite sides of the country.
Right.
At this point, the veil of secrecy is what he said. The Department of Defense didn't want any more discussion of this. So that's as far as he could go with telling us at this AAPB meeting about this. That was enough for me. That's all I needed to know. So I said, okay, as soon as I get this technology, yes, enough of it to want to explore it further, that's for sure. That and my conversation with Les Femi. So I says, wow, there's something here, there's something to this that needs further exploration. In the early 1990s, instruments allowed us to do more than one channel. It allowed us to do what was called poor man's coherence. We could look at 2-channel sum training. We could look at, within an individual, we could look at an EEG from 2 different locations. Wow, this was new, right, to come into the clinical world. I imagine the research world had this for years ahead of time. But we were able now to look at this issue of coherence in the brain and begin to treat problems such as dyslexia and the different learning disorders, because they are the result of disconnection syndromes in the brain. And the first one to actually discuss this, just historically, I'll let you know this, was Joel Lubar. Joel Lubar was discussing how he was treating an aphasic with F3, P3 training, which, if you know anything about neuropsychology, if you're talking about F3, you're basically in what's called Broca's area. P3, you're basically in Wernicke's area. And the pathway between that area, the arcular fasciculus, is a pathway that's known to be damaged in certain types of aphasia. And he was doing P3 minus T3, F3 minus P3 training, and he was reporting changes, improvement, I should say, in the speaking ability and the understanding ability of the individual. Now, at the time, I was a graduate student taking neuropsychology courses and studying aphasia. My textbooks said, and my professor said, aphasia gets better to a certain extent, but there's a ceiling limit, and don't expect any improvement after that. And here's Joel Lubar just happening to mention this technique of using the bipolar training, and this was even probably before we were aware that that lowers coherence or that alters coherence. Yet he was getting improvement in a particular type of aphasia that this patient had. Again, I was listening and very intrigued.
So do you think that there would be a substantive increase in the efficacy of that if coherence was used rather than just a natural coherence effect between 2 electrodes?
I believe it would. I mean, that's what I wanted to test out, or was interested in testing out, or certainly interested in following the literature from that point. Because when here you have a neuropsych professor saying it only goes to a certain extent and then it doesn't improve any further, and then you go to a neurofeedback conference and you have a neurofeedback expert saying, Well, we got improvement using neurofeedback. Again, the lights go on, and we begin to say, this needs further testing. You know, when I listen to this kind of information, you begin to think, well, perhaps there's an application for learning disorders in general. And that's indeed where I think a lot of this started, were people noticing these improvements as side effects, you might say, of doing other types of treatment. And
Do you know what frequencies your brother was training at?
yeah, I believe it was SMR.
Oh, so he was doing SMR between the two different.
Yes, yeah, which is going to alter the coherence. Usually it tends to lower coherence, but and problems that we found out since then that are the result of, or that result in learning disabilities can sometimes be hyper or hypocoherent problems. So perhaps he stumbled onto somebody who had a hypercoherent problem that was causing the aphasia, that when he did when he did the bipolar training, lowered the coherence to a normal level, allowing that functional ability to come back to the individual. So intriguing as all this was, you know, we weren't able to do coherence training until later. We were able to do what was called poor man's coherence. That is to say, when you have one EEG, you know, and then you have another EEG, it was able to take the sum of those two, and then we could put a threshold, say at 10 microvolts, and when the sum of them happened to add together to be 10 microvolts, you could get a tone. So we have a poor man's way of training coherence, which isn't the same as actually looking at the mathematical formula that causes coherence and using that, which came a little bit later. We could, for the first time, reinforce a desired frequency at two cortical areas simultaneously. The feedback reinforcement is sensitive to the amplitude variability as well as the phase relationship between them. So, and again, thinking back, you know, many years, we almost take this technology for granted nowadays, right? There was a time when this was brand new, and when it broke into the ability of us clinicians to be able to do that, we really wanted to do it. We wanted to explore it. It was exciting to see the possibilities. That when two signals are in phase, they will contribute maximally to the sum, thereby generating a reward tone. If the two are out of phase, they will cancel and inhibit the reward. Hence, there is reinforcement, or you can have reinforcement for two brainwave signals to move into a common phase relationship. Now, applying it again to two individuals, there was some subjective rationale for me wanting to do this. There was the 60s notion. I was born in the 50s, but I grew up with the 60s notions of vibes. You know, there was a subtle energy literature even that supported this. And we all experience it, how when we first meet somebody, we tend to either like them or not like them. And social psychology tells us that we make those decisions very quickly. And so there's something about individuals that helps us to sort of gel or not gel with them. Back in the 60s, they called it vibes. Being a musician, I have appreciation for harmony, resonance, attunement, and symphony. So again, there's something inherent within us when we listen to music. When something is harmonious, we know it, and when it isn't, we know it. Norman Geschwind, a neurologist, identified the disconnection syndrome as a pathological state. So he was the one who set the groundwork for us to understand what learning disorders actually are. Learning disorders are actual disconnection syndromes in the brain, as I was just discussing with aphasia. We also have alexia, we have dyslexia, we have visual auditory processing. They're all the result of disconnection syndromes in the brain. And Norman Geschwind, a neurologist, was the first one to begin to define these syndromes. And there are ensemble properties, regulation of state and rhythms, circadian and ultradian, upon which the human brain operates. We had Carl Jung's idea of synchronicity. We knew from social psychology and systems theory that when things work cooperatively together, they tend to work better. We knew that high coherence and good communication go together. And again, a problem when you get into individuals that are conflicted. They don't have good communication, and perhaps they're moving them into better coherence could be helpful. In general, in the EEG, stability and rhythmicity are good, right? So these are basic underlying rationales of why we might want to consider doing 2 individuals with coherence training. Again, too much stability, too much rhythmicity is bad, but we want to keep in mind that virtue always lies between the extremes on both ends of those.